Welcome to the Humour and Games Podcast, an analog and video games podcast about how humor is experienced, designed, and analyzed in games.
We are Scott DeYoung,
Mark Lajeunesse,
and Andre Zanescu,
and we'll be your guides in this 6-episode series. Throughout each episode, we'll break down different theories and forms of humor. We'll draw on interviews with designers, critics, and academics as they discuss the different aspects of humor, their own lived experiences, and how their work utilizes humor in games.
On this episode of the podcast, we speak with Jamie MacDonald about Nordic Larps, Type 2 fun, and feminist comedy.
Could you just kind of introduce yourself to everyone today?
Sure. My name is Jamie MacDonald. I am I'm a whole list. So I live in Helsinki, but I'm originally from Canada. I'm a stand-up comedian. I'm now a PhD student as well, studying the production of emotions in stand-up comedy, particularly as it relates to minority comedians, that is, trans comedians. So let's see how that goes. And I'm somebody who plays quite a bit in the Nordic Larp scene and has been writing in that scene as well for about 10 years.
Well, as a Humour and Games podcast, I have to ask, is there a game or a LARP or a game moment in a LARP that you found particularly hilarious?
I thought that was such a great question because I ended up going through a whole list of all the LARPs that I've played, and I know that there are hilarious moments, but I find them really difficult to remember. I mostly just remember that I had a really good time with a bunch of people, and that we laughed a lot. I can't remember exactly what the funny bits would have been, but two LARPs might stand out as particularly funny, but not necessarily ha-ha funny, just horrible funny. And those would be Panopticorp, which was a satirical ad agency. And the second one, which I just played last year, was The Future is Straight, which is sort of like The Office meets conversion therapy, but in a darker way.
Sorry, so it sounds like quite a dark game. So in what ways was that humorous or funny, perhaps?
So it definitely needs unpacking. The LARP was set at a fictional, in a fictional environment of a society that was a little bit different from ours, where gender roles and sexuality were much more policed and much more normatized. And it was played by adults playing young people and the camp counselors, as it were, at a conversion camp. And so I was actually playing the director of the camp, which means I got to sort of set a lot of the tone. And I ended up bringing a lot of like Marcus Aurelius and reading aloud all this stoicism, it was just the darkest comedy I could possibly think of, like standing in front of a bunch of players who I know are queer. And we're all like, almost everybody who plays this game is queer. Almost everybody who plays this game has heard all of these things said to them at some point in their lives about, well, why can't you just, suck it up and just be normal kind of thing. And what we did was we kind of leaned really hard into that and played it so that it was like parody of the crappy things.
So how did that experience happen for you, but also other players? Like, what was the tone kind of coming out of a game like that?
I mean, the LARP worked really well, I think, because everybody played it fairly straight. What a terrible pun. But everybody played it as though they were really in this situation and it really mattered. And actually, during the LARP, most of the people who were playing the staff would just play a couple of scenes. Then we would go into the staff room. We would kind of yell and cry together because it was so horrible, and then go back in and keep playing with everybody. But the people who were playing the camp goers, the kids who were being, converted or being told whatever kind of whatever arguments they were being told, when they weren't in front of the camp counselors, they were having a great time, of course, because in the fiction, this was then when most of them as characters had ever met another queer kid. So, I mean, it was an absurd situation that you take all these kids who are supposed to not be queer, and they've most of them have never even met another queer kid, and then you put them all in camp together and expect nothing to happen. So they were having a great time together when they weren't crying. But this is a Nordic LARP thing. We have this thing called Type 2 fun.
Do you want to kind of expand on that idea of Type 2 fun for people who might not be as familiar with it?
Sure, most people would not be. Jaakko might have mentioned it. Type 2 fun is when it's not fun, but it's fun. So you're having a terrible time. You're in the rain. It is cold. Your character is miserable. They've just lost everything that they held dear, and the future looks terrible. And as a character, you're having the worst time you can possibly imagine. And as a player, you're just like, yeah, it's great.
So just to clarify, you put someone in a situation that across the board is just sounds awful, but for a player, because you get to kind of engage with it, it's a wonderfully humorous and enjoyable time.
Yes, yeah, pretty much. And and we have, this means that we have in the Nordic LARP scenes slightly interesting conventions about playing to get yourself in more trouble. So there's a less kind of competitive edge with the LARPs in the Nordic scene, whereas like many other LARPs have people who would like, their characters would like to end up on top. And in a Nordic LARP, you're more likely to end up with people who go like, how can I get to the bottom in the most interesting way? Because that will collectively allow us to tell a story that is more interesting. And that's sort of a convention.
I really like that. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to like the origins of the term, as I feel like it's a theme that we're seeing in like online games in terms of like conflict and bad feelings that kind of come up there. And so do you know more kind of about where that term came up and why it's so prominent within that space?
The actual, like the Type 2 fun as a term, I believe that was coined by Markus Montola, who is a Finnish, again, game researcher and designer. And he talked about, it was in one of the sort of, we have a conference every year and produce books and write about various topics that we think is kind of para-academic. It's getting more in academic and also less academic at the same time. But Markus was the first person to coin the idea of Type 2 fun. However, I think it comes from just a kind of little perfect storm of a situation where generally when you have people who live in the Nordics, compared to, say, Brits or North Americans, Nordic people tend to be more collectivist and tend to be less competitive. And that's just sort of something that's been baked into the societal norms. And so it gets reflected in the way people play. And then at the same time, you had a lot of people who had, they had grown up with your orcs in the forest LARPs and magical spells LARPs. And then when, they were hitting their 20s and 30s, they were like, wait a second, like, why don't we do like a LARP where it's, we're having a breakup and it's just two players on a balcony. And let's play that, or let's play when we can play an entirely different economic system or something like that. They started to play all of these kind of different ideas. And for a while, it was also quite edgy, as in we were trying to make games that were hard, like the kind of 2000s hardcore vibe you kind of saw everywhere in culture. If you look at like WWF wrestling and stuff like that, it's all, more pain, more intensity. And I think that may have influenced where that went in the beginning. But as that started to play more and more, people got a little bit tired of the just being hardcore or suffering for suffering's sake. And then it started to be more emphasis on, okay, how can we do this, but actually make sure we have a good time? Or how can we do a difficult human situation and not be kind of like appropriative and indulgent about it? How can we play it so that it's somehow we're trying to connect with something that we can connect with, and let's not lie to ourselves that we can get all this empathy just from playing a game.
I think that's really great. I also love the idea of a breakup on a balcony game. 'Cause I wonder how that markets, but that's an aside more. But do you kind of incorporate this type 2 humor in your own work as a comedian? Or is your work kind of situated elsewhere within the spectrum of humor?
That's a really good question too. I think I occasionally break out into a sort of type 2 humor, which I don't know. It's like it can be a darkness, or it can be that amazing moment you sometimes have where you're going along and things are funny and funny and funny and funny, and then you say something just a little bit devastating, or just a little bit off, and it kind of drops everybody in the room. And if it's something that kind of needed to be said, and then it has impact, and then the whole room is kind of like, oh, then that can be a really nice thing. And that's really hard to design for. It has to be, it kind of has to be a part of the play of the moment.
So is there an element of kind of feeling the audience out, and how do you kind of go about doing that to know that you're okay to kind of turn to those moments in your practice?
That just comes from experience a lot of the time. But it's not necessarily, it's not foolproof by any stretch of the imagination. One of the greatest things about live stand-up is how frequently actually people fail. And that sounds like something that is like, that's the thing where you go to a stand-up club and somebody's awful, or they're just off tonight, and everybody in the room is embarrassed. And for most people, especially non-comedians, that's just the worst feeling in the world. And for a comedian, that's kind of a feeling of like, aha, something is actually going on here, because there's some real discomfort, and this person is going to really try to figure out what did they do to lose the crowd, and is there anything that they can do to bring them back? And sometimes, like, the harder you try, the worse crap you get in. And then sometimes you just kind of try to coast and go through it, and it works. But when you have like any audience, I'm always listening for what did they laugh at in other people's sets? Are they, if somebody said something that's about, local politics, did they go for it, or did they just were they lukewarm? If there's something that's just a very silly language pun, did they love it? Did they really like a dirty story? And then you start to get the feel of like the crowd.
I really like that, and I think there's a conversation here to be have around like the element of performance when we're thinking about humor, the element of like scripted humor, and kind of the element of interpretive humor, which sounds like you're doing a little bit of all three in your practice. But could you maybe speak a little bit more to kind of those pieces?
Yeah, like, so when you have so performing humor from the stage or performing stand-up from the stage, different comedians will have different ways of going about it. Some people have everything written down and rehearsed to the breath, to the moment. They know exactly how they're going to say it. And that's somebody like, Jimmy Carr, bless his cotton socks. I can't think of anybody else, but he's very regimented in that way. Then you have somebody like, or Tig Notaro as actually, she knows what she's going to do. And then you have people like Mark Maron or Eddie Izzard, who they have an idea and they go out talking with the idea. And every single time they go out, the idea gets embellished or something gets forgotten and it just falls away, so that the set is changing every single time it's being done. And when you make people laugh from the stage, there are a bunch of like conventions and a bunch of little rules and tricks that that tend to work. So you tend to learn what those are, and you start to learn how to implement them instinctively almost. And then you have this thing where you're kind of reading the audience at any given night, and you can change your set if you know that the rest of your set is not going to go well with them. And then there's the kind of personality and temperament thing where maybe you need to be in a little bit of an improvised mode yourself to kind of keep it alive, keep it connected, keep it playful in that way. I'm definitely an improviser, and it's not the easiest way to go, but I found that it's how I roll. I can't go on and say the same thing every night. There's always a new joke every night.
And I'm just kind of curious because we opened up with that conversation of LARPs and how you were like, there's no specific moment I find funny, but this overall experience was. And I wonder how that discussion you just had around thinking your preparation level for a comedic bit translates into your participation and or creation of a LARP. Are there similar themes in that regard, or is it quite different because you're in this game space?
I think the one thing about having done a lot of stand-up is that a lot of people prepare a lot more for a LARP. I tend to be the sort of person who I need to make sure my costume's reasonably good. And I need to make sure that all my relations when I go in are not, completely paper thin, and I've done some work with them. But what I really, really enjoy is having a robust environment, like a social environment that I throw my character into and just see what this character comes up with. I hate pre-planning scenes. Some people like to do this. I don't like to do it. I hate to know where things are going to go exactly. I much, much more enjoy, and I'm very comfortable being in because I know that if there's nothing, I will come up with something. I'm very confident in my ability to come up with stuff.
Well, I think that shows in some of the work that I've seen you do. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to your role as a comedian, because I know that you mentioned that you focus on minority comedians and feminist humor in a lot of your work. And I wonder if you could just kind of speak to that for our general audience a little bit.
I ended up starting the Helsinki Feminist Comedy Night, and then later a Feminist Comedy Academy, because I was lonely. It was 2015 or something, 2014, 2015. And it was actually as a response to a challenge that had been given to me by a curator in like a performance art context. They were asking, like, you're doing stand-up now. So is feminism funny? And I said, I actually don't know. So I thought, well, okay, let's try this. Let's make a feminist comedy night. And the first couple of nights were crazy interesting for many reasons. I have never seen an audience and a bunch of comedians more terrified of each other. Everybody was really, they didn't know what's the baseline. What can you laugh at and what can't you? But also, like, what exactly are the values that we're going for here? Is it funny to make fun of this person or that person? Is it funny to make fun of yourself? Is being angry funny? Is something that happened to you that was awful? Is that funny in some way? Like, people just didn't know. And all we knew was that, feminists are always online and we're always upset. So we couldn't, we didn't have an imagination of exactly what like kind of a feminist comedy club would look like. And so what my favorite thing about that, doing that club, and also we run this queer burlesque comedy and drag and also other performance club variety show called Punch Up, and learning how to build an audience's expectations in those and build a kind of culture has been really changing over time. And it's not necessarily for everybody. And I've had feedback where I've joked about something that was not okay for this or that person or this or that group of people. And then you hear about it and you figure out how to, do better from there, or to improve your act to avoid misunderstandings from there is another way that it can happen.
I think that's like a really nice way to put it. And I'm curious how you were able to kind of tease out that baseline. As you mentioned, everyone was so terrified at the start. How did you come about making that happen? I mean, it sounds like part of that was because there was a setting of the scene by calling it a feminist comedy night. But how did you kind of deal with that setting into the actual practice of the space?
I think at first I didn't want to limit what anybody said. And I also didn't require that my comedians, who I would ask to be on that show, I didn't require that anybody had any particular characteristics, and I didn't even require that they were a feminist themselves. I just said that, look, it's a feminist comedy night, your audience is feminist, and they're paying money. So what I don't want is a situation where somebody just comes on stage and trolls feminists for 10 minutes in a mean-spirited and boring way, and then thinks that they've done their great bit for mankind. It was more about like every single iteration and every single thing that came onto that stage and was said on that stage helped build it helped build that baseline. And also because I was hosting it every time, which now is just a joke in itself, because there's a middle-aged white man running a feminist comedy night, and if I point out I'm trans, then, then they go, is that better? I don't know. But because we had me hosting every single time, and I will talk to the audience about this or that, and mostly talk about what's been going on in the city and in the country and in the world, it does set people at least know that there's one consistent element, which is me. And I think that helps. I think that helps at least, give a specific show a specific character. But then what I also really like is that now, like the gig that I'm going to be doing this Saturday is another feminist comedy club in Helsinki, which is run by 3 people who were in the Feminist Comedy Academy. And I'm delighted by this, because I don't want to be the hegemonic voice of feminist stand-up. So it's really exciting to see other people, and they are running their club in a slightly different way from mine. And that's totally, I'm absolutely game for that.
I think that's something that speaks to the work that you're doing, seeing that others are kind of picking up the mantle and continuing it in their own ways, in their own practice, as you've discussed and we've discussed, that it's quite amorphous in how humor kind of evolves anyways. And I'm curious, as we were chatting a little bit before we started recording today, and so perhaps we can kind of talk about that a bit now, is how has kind of humor been for you throughout the past 2 years, as we've seen the setting and the scene of discussion for a lot of jokes and what's funny shift and morph, and the spaces where we're making that humor, whether it be online or offline, have kind of shifted?
I really miss the live experience. I miss it so much, and I think it's so important. This is something that I would really like to be writing about in my own thesis when it's done in however many years, God willing, in a fast infield. But online is so depersonalized that online mostly results in the kind of darker play, the bullying play, which is still play. It's just, and mean humor is still humor. It's just mean. And I think it's much easier to get angry. Like, nobody ever loses sleep because somebody said something nice to them. But you can read one tweet and be awake for the next 4 hours, just trying to somehow resolve that unsettling feeling in your body. But the really like the extraordinary thing about laughter, and especially about being in a group of people with laughter. And this is like why like writing a comedic book or writing a funny tweet is not the same as writing a joke that will land well in a room full of people. Laughter is like it's an involuntary physiological response, and it's very social, and it communicates many different social things. Not all of them are literally what is meant by the laughter. Sometimes we laugh because we are nervous and we want to show that we're not threatening. And if you also get a group of people and one starts to laugh, it's actually quite difficult for the others not to start laughing. So when you have a room full of people who have paid money, they've come to a comedy club, there's an expectation and even a hope of being, entertained in this way. And some people laugh, other people laugh. And there's a really different vibe from being in a room full of people who are vibrating with this response to things that are being said, either in recognition or in estrangement, or out of a mean-spirited, boundary-breaking, transgressive way. But being in a room full of people where that happens is something I really, really miss.
And just to kind of bring this back, and as we come to the end of our time, to the question of games and humor, how does that kind of liveness of the joke and the laughter translate to game spaces? I know in LARP there's talks of like breaking character, and we also have online games that are filled with toxicity, which might be considered dark forms of humor, right? So how does that kind of liveness in space kind of translate to these game spaces?
I think we could think about laughter as a social, as a kind of social phenomenon. And it's great when we laugh at something that is funny, but most of the times when we laugh, it's not at something that is funny or a joke. There are many more reasons to laugh, and they're mostly to communicate meaning. When we talk, we laugh, and we laugh at other people's speech, often just to communicate that we understand each other. But that's laughter, and that's not necessarily humor. But something that I think, especially like in a minority space, but also in a game space, is that the shared humor or sharing a joke requires that you share a lot of other things. You have to share some values, you have to share an understanding of what is going on, and you have to also agree on the tone of the room, and you have to agree what is going to be, I don't want to get into the benign violation theory because that's not my favorite theory, but you have to kind of agree what is a good way to break the norm and what is not a acceptable way to break the norm. And if everybody's on the same page, then you can have an awful lot of exploration and play and fun together. And it works very well also in games and in LARP. It's the same. If somebody is griefing while everybody else is trying to have a good time, then it's no good. But if everybody's griefing, then that is the good time.
I think you put it in a really nice way, and we're also kind of at the end of our time. So I want to thank you for kind of making that transition point for us. And are there any kind of closing thoughts that you had now that you've been kind of thinking about all of this around kind of humor and games that you really wanted to kind of get out? Because I know that you were thinking about these things before we started chatting, and sometimes the conversation takes us away from those kind of key points we wanted to get to.
Let's see. I think actually I've managed to talk about most of the things that were really on my mind. I think most of the thing that is really interesting to me is the ways in which humor forms community. And humor is also a way, like in the building of the Feminist Comedy Night vibe, humor is a way of negotiating that building of community together. You try a joke, and if it doesn't land, then okay, that's a boundary. We shouldn't go further in that direction. you try another boundary and maybe that one's a good one. So over the course of many of these kinds of jokes and bits of humor, you can establish together what is the trust and what's the shape of the community that you have.
That was our conversation with Jamie MacDonald. Thanks for listening, and see you next time on the Humor and Games podcast.